The Yellow Sea sits between the Korean Peninsula and the Chinese mainland, like a shallow bowl of history, nowhere deeper than 100 meters. Its bottom a continental shelf that has swallowed the debris of every conflict fought across it for 3,000 years. It is not a tactically comfortable body of water for a modern surface combatant. The shallow depths complicate submarine operations, compress the geometry of surface engagements, and create a sonar environment so acoustically complex that passive detection ranges are a fraction of what the same systems achieve in deep water. The coastlines on three sides create a radar clutter environment that shore-based electronic warfare systems can exploit in ways that are simply not available in open ocean operating areas. It is an environment that favors the adversary who has had decades to study it, map it, and pre-position assets within it. And North Korea has had exactly those decades with exactly that focus, because the Yellow Sea's western approaches are the most likely axis for any maritime operation against its coastline, and the Korean People's Army Naval Force has built its doctrine around making that axis as costly as possible for anyone attempting to use it. The joint exercise had been planned for 11 months. A standard bilateral maritime exercise between U.S. and Republic of Korea naval forces. The kind of combined operations training event that the alliance conducts regularly, publicly, and deliberately. Because the regularity and the publicness are part of the strategic message the exercise is meant to send. The exercise scenario for this iteration focused on combined anti-submarine warfare operations, surface escort doctrine, and integrated air defense. The three capability domains where U.S. and ROK naval integration had the most operational value, and where the joint training produced measurable improvements in interoperability that could be documented, assessed, and built upon in subsequent exercises. The exercise area had been chosen in the western Yellow Sea, in international waters approximately 90 nautical miles west of the Korean Peninsula's western coastline. 90 nautical miles is well outside the 12 nautical mile territorial sea limit and outside the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone's security provisions. It is legally unambiguous international water. What it is not, from a North Korean operational perspective, is distant. 90 nautical miles from the Korean western coastline places the exercise area within reach of a significant portion of the KPANF's surface and subsurface inventory. Within range of shore-based anti-ship missile systems positioned along the western coastal defensive belt, and inside the surveillance coverage of the extensive radar and sensor network that North Korea has built into the coast facing the Yellow Sea. The exercise had been underway for 31 hours when the picture changed. The U.S. destroyer and its ROK Navy counterpart, a KDX-3 Batch 2 destroyer equipped with the Korean Aegis combat system, were operating in a coordinated surface action group formation, the two ships separated by approximately 4 nautical miles. Their radar pictures merged into a single integrated air picture through the tactical data link, connecting both vessels. The combined formation gave the air defense picture a significantly wider sensor coverage area than either ship could achieve independently, and the integrated data link meant that either ship's weapon systems could engage threats tracked by the other ship's radar. The combination was the entire point of combined operations. Two ships operating together could produce a defensive capability that exceeded the simple sum of their individual capabilities. At 2:44 a.m., the integrated picture registered something unexpected. The ROK destroyer's radar, operating on a slightly different frequency than the U.S. ship's SPI array, which created a complementary search geometry that covered angular blind spots in both ships' individual radar pictures. Reported contacts forming at a bearing of 334 degrees, range 71 nautical miles. The contacts were small, very small. The individual radar cross-sections were below the threshold that either ship's radar would normally flag automatically as a threat contact, not because the radar couldn't detect them, but because contacts at that signature level, at that range, in the Yellow Sea's cluttered surface radar environment, would ordinarily be processed as noise returns, or small surface debris, rather than tracked as discrete contacts. What flagged them was not their size. It was their number and their movement. The ROK destroyer's track processing system, configured for the specific clutter characteristics of the Yellow Sea operating environment by software updates developed specifically for Western Korean coastal defense missions, counted 43 contacts in the initial processing. Sweep. Not scattered randomly across the bearing, but organized, moving in a coherent formation geometry, all on approximately the same bearing and speed vector, approaching at a measured pace that placed them at the outer edge of what any drone system could sustain over the transit distance from the nearest North Korean coastal staging area. 43 contacts, moving in formation, from North Korean coastal waters. The TAO on the U.S. Diora destroyer received the track data from the data link at 2:44 a.m. and 30 seconds. His first call was to the combat systems officer to verify that the ROK track data was being correctly ingested into the Aegis picture. It was. His second call was to confirm the bearing of origin against the known positions of KPANF coastal staging areas. The bearing of origin placed the contact source precisely at a coastal inlet on North Korea's western coastline. That intelligence had flagged in the preceding weeks as a location of elevated activity. Increased surface movement, resupply patterns, and the kind of covered barge activity that is consistent with the forward staging of small maritime platforms. The contacts resolved on the third radar sweep into a cleaner picture. Not 43, 51. 8 additional contacts had been below detection threshold on the first 2 sweeps, running at lower altitude or masked by the surface clutter, and had only become trackable as the formation closed the range and the radar return geometry improved. 51 contacts, approaching in a loose fan formation. Their individual flight profiles consistent with a small one-way attack drone airframe. Not the sophisticated Shahid series engineering that Iranian proxy forces had deployed in the Red Sea, but a simpler, cheaper, more numerous platform. North Korean domestic production of small unmanned systems had accelerated significantly in the preceding years. The program benefiting from technology transfers, component acquisition through third-party networks, and the focused reverse engineering effort of a state that had identified cheap drone mass production as a strategic priority for exactly this kind of asymmetric saturation mission. Cheap, numerous, expendable. That was the doctrine. The math was immediately clear to the TAO. 51 contacts at current closure rate placed the leading edge of the formation at engagement range in approximately 11 minutes. 11 minutes was enough time to build fire control solutions, sequence the engagement, and open the outer ring engagement with margin. What 11 minutes was not enough time for was a deliberate, methodical, one-by-one engagement of 51 contacts in sequence using the Aegis system's standard engagement protocols. Not because the system couldn't track 51 contacts simultaneously, but because 51 contacts at the intercept cost of even the cheapest available interceptor represented an expenditure calculation that had to be managed carefully against the ship's total VLS inventory. The TAO transmitted the threat picture to the ROK destroyer through the data link and called for coordinated engagement execution. The 2-ship formation's integrated air defense capability was the answer to the math problem the contact count presented. By dividing the engagement responsibility between 2 Aegis-equipped ships, the total interceptor load could be distributed across a larger combined VLS inventory, and the engagement geometry of 2 ships separated by 4 nautical miles gave the formation a threat arc coverage advantage that a single ship could not replicate. The ROK tactical action officer confirmed engagement coordination within 40 seconds. The North Korean drone formation had closed to 58 nautical miles when the outer ring engagement opened. The SM-2 interceptors allocated to the initial engagement wave were not the preferred weapon against small, low-altitude drone targets. The SM-2's semi-active guidance requires continuous radar illumination from the launching ship, which constrains the number of simultaneous engagements that can be sustained against a dense target package. But the SM-2 inventory was larger than the SM-6 inventory, and the outer ring engagement against the leading edge of the formation, where the contacts were at sufficient range to allow the semi-active guidance geometry to work effectively, was the appropriate use of the larger, less expensive interceptor. 4 SM-2 interceptors launched from the U.S. destroyer in a coordinated ripple at 2:51 a.m. Simultaneously, the ROK destroyer launched 3 SM-2 interceptors of its own. Their fire control solutions built from the integrated picture rather than the ROK ships' individual sour track data, giving them the benefit of the combined formation's tracking geometry. 7 interceptors, 7 targets in the leading echelon of the formation, the engagement geometry working across both ships simultaneously. 5 of the 7 contacts were eliminated in the initial ripple. 2 SM-2 intercepts missed, 1 due to a tracking geometry error introduced by a momentary data link degradation that lasted approximately 1.4 seconds, long enough to interrupt the fire control solution update cycle at a critical point in the intercept geometry, and 1 due to a terminal evasion maneuver by the contact that was more aggressive than the pre-engagement flight profile had suggested. The contact's terminal deviation was not sophisticated, a simple altitude drop followed by a bearing change, but it was enough to defeat a semi-active guidance solution that had been committed before the deviation occurred. 2 contacts through the outer ring, 44 remaining in the main body, now at 49 nautical miles and continuing to close. The data link degradation was the first sign of something that would complicate the engagement for the next 12 minutes. The Yellow Sea's electromagnetic environment is not neutral. North Korea operates an extensive suite of electronic warfare capabilities along its western coastline. Capabilities that had been built specifically to degrade the kind of networked operations that U.S. and allied naval forces depend on. The 1.4-second data link degradation at 2:51 a.m. was not random. The electronic warfare system on the U.S. destroyer classified the interference source within seconds of detecting it. A focused jamming emission from a bearing consistent with a shore-based EW installation on the North Korean coast, operating on the data link frequency band with enough power to create a localized interference environment in the operating area. The jamming was intermittent, not continuous. That was a deliberate choice by the adversary's electronic warfare operators. Continuous jamming would allow the formation's EW systems to characterize the emission precisely and implement countermeasures more effectively, while intermittent jamming created a more complex interference pattern that was harder to counter cleanly, and produced exactly the kind of momentary degradations that had already affected the first SM-2 intercept wave. The EIW officer implemented the formation's anti-jamming protocols, switching the data link to its frequency hopping mode and accepting the slightly reduced data throughput rate that the anti-jamming mode imposed in exchange for the improved interference resistance it provided. The data link stabilized. The integrated picture held. But the EW engagement was ongoing, and every system operator in both ships' combat centers knew that the adversary was not simply watching the engagement from the shore. It was participating in it, using its electronic warfare capability to degrade the formation's integrated operations at the margins, creating small failures and momentary gaps that accumulated into a degraded overall performance that would not appear in any single data point, but would be visible in the aggregate outcome. The SM-6 engagement against the main body of the drone formation opened at 41 nautical miles. The SM-6's active radar seeker operated independently of the ship's illuminator, which made it significantly less vulnerable to the data link jamming that had affected the SM-2 engagement. Each SM-6 found and tracked its own target after launch, requiring only the initial targeting handoff from the fire control system rather than continuous guidance updates from the ship. 3 SM-6 interceptors launched from the U.S. destroyer, 2 from the ROK destroyer. 5 contacts eliminated in the first SM-6 wave. Then something changed in the drone formation's behavior. At 37 nautical miles, the loose fan formation that the 51 contacts had maintained since first detection collapsed. The contacts dispersed, not randomly, but in a deliberate pattern that expanded the formation's lateral width by approximately 60% in the span of 90 seconds. Where the formation had previously occupied a roughly 12 nautical mile wide approach corridor, it now occupied a 20-mile wide approach corridor, extending the threat arc that the formation's fire control geometry had to cover. and forcing both ships to manage engagements at greater off-axis angles from their optimal weapons employment zones. The dispersion was a programmed behavior, a formation-level tactic embedded in the drone swarm's control architecture that activated at a predetermined range threshold. The contacts had not received a command from a human operator to disperse. They had reached a range trigger and the programmed behavior had executed. It was autonomous tactical adaptation and it was effective. The engagement geometry became significantly more complex for both ships simultaneously. The off-axis intercept solutions requiring more processing time to build, and introducing greater uncertainty into the intercept geometry than the frontal engagement that had preceded the dispersion. The combined formation's SM-6 inventory continued to engage through the dispersion, but the intercept rate slowed. Contacts that had been in clean frontal engagement geometry were now approaching from angles that required solution geometry corrections, and the data links reduced. Throughput in anti-jamming mode meant that the combined picture updates were slightly less current than the individual ship's own track data, creating small timing discrepancies in the coordinated engagement sequence that further reduced the efficiency of the combined salvo. By the time the drone formation reached 15 nautical miles, 31 contacts had been eliminated by the combined SM-2 and SM-6 engagement waves. 20 contacts remained, distributed across a wide bearing arc, approaching both ships simultaneously from multiple off-axis angles. The ESSM engagement opened, both ships committing their shorter-range interceptors to the contacts that the outer ring engagement had not resolved. The sky was crossed with intercept geometries pulling across a 60-degree threat arc as the ESSM seekers acquired and tracked their assigned contacts. The engagement was no longer clean. The wide dispersion of the remaining contacts meant that both ships' ESSM batteries were working the threat arc simultaneously, and the risk of engagement deconfliction errors. 2 interceptors assigned to the same contact, leaving another contact unengaged, required active management by both TAOs, working the Coordinated Engagement Protocol. 14 ESSM intercepts confirmed across both ships between 15 and 4 nautical miles. 6 contacts surviving into the terminal engagement layer. The 6 contacts split between the 2 ships, 3 approaching the U.S. destroyer from the port bow and starboard quarter simultaneously, 3 approaching the ROK destroyer from its starboard beam in a tight cluster that the ROK TAO recognized as a deliberate massing of terminal threats against a single aim point on his ship's hull. Both CIWS systems on the U.S. destroyer were already in automatic engagement mode. The forward mount acquired the port bow contacts. The aft mount pivoted to cover the starboard quarter approach. The forward mount eliminated 2 contacts at ranges of 2.1 miles and 1.6 miles, respectively. The third contact, the most aggressive of the 3, operating at an altitude of approximately 2 meters above the surface and executing a continuous S-turn approach pattern that interrupted the CIWS tracking continuity. Required both mounts to transition tracking before the aft mount achieved a clean engagement solution at 940 meters. 940 meters. The fragmentation pattern from the disintegration reached the port hull at scattered intervals, the high-velocity composite fragments impacting the hull plating below the weather deck in a dispersed spread. Damage control teams reporting 6 fragment impacts on the port side, none penetrating the structural hull, 1 fragment striking the port anchor chain housing and leaving a visible gouge in the steel fitting that would require a maintenance assessment but presented no operational impact. On the ROK destroyer, the 3 contact cluster approaching the starboard beam was met by a coordinated response from the ship's CIWS mount and a final ESSM interceptor that the ROKTAO had held in reserve for exactly this contingency. The ESSM eliminated 1 contact at 2.4 miles. The CIWS mount engaged the remaining 2 in rapid succession. First contact at 1.1 miles, second contact at 720 meters. 720 meters from the ROK destroyer's starboard beam, close enough that the pressure wave from the airframe disintegration was felt on the bridge as a brief, sharp vibration through the ship's structure that the officer of the watch registered before he had fully processed what caused it. At 2:58 a.m. and 33 seconds, both ships confirmed clear radar pictures, 14 minutes and 3 seconds from first detection to engagement conclusion. 51 drone contacts detected, tracked, and engaged across 2 coordinated Aegis-equipped ships. 0 hull penetrations. 0 personnel casualties. 6 minor fragment impacts on the U.S. detritus. Destroyer's porthole plating. One fragment impact on the ROK destroyer's superstructure. No structural significance. The weapons expenditure summary for both ships combined. 11 SM-2 interceptors, 9 SM-6 interceptors, 16 ESSM interceptors across both ships' inventories. Approximately 4,100 rounds of 20 mm through 3 CIWS mounts. 2 from the US destroyer. 1 from the ROK destroyer. The combined cost of the defensive interceptor expenditure for both ships, approximately $31 million. The estimated cost of 51 North Korean one-way attack drones, based on the program acquisition cost assessments derived from intelligence reporting on the DPRK unmanned systems production effort, between $200,000 and $600,000 for the entire launch package, including the operational overhead of the coastal staging infrastructure, the electronic warfare support mission, and the navigation of the coastal deployment. Perhaps $1 million total, $31 million of defensive expenditure to defeat $1 million of attack. The ratio was more extreme than anything the Iranian proxy force engagements in the Red Sea had produced, and it illustrated a strategic arithmetic that the alliance's defense planners had been studying with increasing urgency for the preceding 2 years. North Korea's drone production program was not sophisticated. It did not need to be sophisticated to be strategically effective. It needed to be cheap, numerous, and launched in quantities sufficient to exhaust the interceptor inventory faster than it could be replenished. And the Yellow Sea's geographic confinement, with its restricted logistics access and the distance from forward ammunition logistics ships, made the replenishment timeline longer than it would be in more accessible operating areas. The exercise continued. The joint training plan was modified to account for the weapons expenditure, but it continued, because stopping it would have been its own kind of message. And the alliance's message was that it would not be deterred from operating in the waters it had every legal right to operate in. The North Korean coastal staging position that had launched the attack was not struck. The decision not to strike was made within the alliance's command authority in the minutes following the engagement, based on the same escalation calculus that governed every response to Syrian in a conflict that had not yet crossed into formal declared hostilities. The staging position existed. It was known. It was not struck, because striking it would have represented a threshold crossing that the political authorities had not authorized. And the absence of that authorization was a deliberate constraint accepted because the alternatives were worse. The staging position would be used again. The electronic warfare installation that had conducted the jamming mission against the data link continued to operate. The 2 KPANF fast patrol boats that satellite imagery later confirmed had been positioned as the surface element of the coordinated attack package, apparently held back from the engagement when the drone strike failed to generate the confusion the plan had required. Returned to their harbor positions without having exposed themselves to engagement range. The engagement had been a drone-only event from the adversary's perspective. The surface element had been the follow-on strike, planned for the gap that the drone saturation was supposed to create, and had not been committed when that gap did not materialize. The follow-on strike had not happened. The gap had not materialized because the combined formation's integrated air defense had held when the North Korean planners had expected it to be overwhelmed. They would refine. They would plan around the integrated air picture next time. They would attempt to find the seam between the two ships' coordinated engagement, the moment where the data link jamming could be timed precisely enough to create a genuine gap in the combined fire control picture, rather than the marginal degradation it had achieved this time. The Yellow Sea holds its history without comment. 3,000 years of conflict recorded in the sediment of a shallow continental shelf that has never stopped being contested and never will. The exercise formation held its position in international water and continued its training mission. The ROK and US ships working through their coordinated procedures with the specific knowledge that the procedures they were practicing were not hypothetical. They had just used them. The data from the engagement would be analyzed by both navies in the days following, the intercept rates and the ESSM deconfliction performance, and the data link degradation effects all studied against doctrine and fed back into the training cycle. It was the same work, the next day, that it had been the day before. The threat had been real. The defense had held. The work continued because the work is never finished. Only interrupted, then resumed, then interrupted again, on the water that remembers everything and concedes nothing.